The morning fog rolled in from San Francisco Bay, casting a gray veil over the towering glass mansion perched on the hills of Presidio Heights. Margaret Chen adjusted her modest gray uniform and checked her watch, 7 a.m. sharp. 43 years of practicing law had taught her the value of punctuality, and even now, 3 months into her new life as a domestic worker, old habits died hard. She pressed the brass doorbell of the Whitmore estate, listening to its elaborate chimes echo through what she knew to be 12,000 square feet of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, she'd been representing clients who lived in homes just like this one. Now she was cleaning them. "Margaret, you're right on time," said Elena, the head housekeeper, opening the heavy oak door. Elena Rodriguez had been working for the Whitmore family for 15 years, and her kind eyes held a mixture of professional efficiency and genuine warmth. "Mr. Whitmore has guests arriving this afternoon for an important business meeting. The study needs to be spotless." Margaret nodded, collecting her supplies from the utility closet. The familiar weight of the vacuum cleaner felt foreign in her hands, so different from the leather briefcases she'd carried through courthouse corridors for decades. Her fingers, once accustomed to shuffling through legal documents and typing briefs, now gripped spray bottles and microfiber cloths. As she made her way through the mansion's opulent corridors, Margaret couldn't help but observe the details that others might miss. The original Monet hanging in the hallway, likely worth more than most people's homes. The Italian marble flooring that showed every footprint and required daily attention. The custom millwork that spoke of old money and established power. But it was the sounds that truly told the story of this house. Margaret had learned to navigate her new world by becoming invisible, moving through rooms like a ghost, while the family conducted their lives around her. In her legal career, she developed an acute ability to listen, really listen, to the subtext of conversations, the pauses between words, the tension in voices. Those skills served her well now, though in ways she'd never imagined. The study was Mr. Whitmore's domain, a masculine sanctuary of dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and a massive mahogany desk that commanded respect. As Margaret began dusting the intricate carved details of the bookshelf, she heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. "Clean the room and stay quiet," came the familiar authoritative voice of Richard Whitmore as he entered with his business partner, Thomas Sterling. Both men were in their 50s, wearing expensive suits that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly salary. They barely glanced in her direction as they settled into the leather chairs near the fireplace. Margaret had perfected the art of being simultaneously present and invisible. She continued her work methodically, her movements deliberate but unobtrusive. To them, she was simply part of the furniture, another household fixture that maintained their comfortable lifestyle. "The Henderson acquisition is more complicated than we thought," Sterling said, loosening his tie as he spoke. His voice carried the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to making million-dollar decisions before lunch. "There are environmental concerns at the manufacturing site that weren't disclosed in the initial reports." Margaret's hand paused for just a moment on the picture frame she was dusting. Environmental concerns, non-disclosure. In her previous life, these would have been red flags requiring immediate legal attention. "How significant?" Whitmore asked, pouring himself a scotch from the crystal decanter despite the early hour. The amber liquid caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows. "Significant enough that if it comes to light, we're looking at potential lawsuits, cleanup costs in the millions, and regulatory nightmares that could drag on for years," Sterling replied, rubbing his temples. The previous owners knew about the contamination and deliberately concealed it from the environmental impact assessments. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She'd handled cases like this before. Environmental fraud, deliberate concealment of hazardous conditions, corporate liability that could affect entire communities. Her legal mind began automatically cataloging the potential violations and liability issues. "What do you suggest?" Whitmore's tone had shifted to something more calculating, more dangerous. "We proceed as planned," Sterling said firmly. "The purchase goes through next week. By the time anyone discovers the environmental issues, the liability will have transferred to us, but we'll have structured the acquisition through shell companies. If lawsuits come, they'll hit the subsidiaries, not the parent company. And the cleanup costs? We'll declare bankruptcy on the subsidiary companies if necessary. Walk away clean while the lawyers fight over the scraps. Meanwhile, we'll have already extracted the valuable assets and intellectual property." Margaret's hands continued their mechanical cleaning motions, but her mind was racing. What they were describing wasn't just morally questionable, it was potentially criminal. Fraudulent conveyance, environmental crimes, deliberate harm to communities that would be left with contaminated land, and no recourse for cleanup or compensation. What about the community impact studies that are supposed to happen before we break ground on the new development? Whitmore asked. Sterling waved dismissively. We have people in the planning department. The studies will show whatever we need them to show. Besides, it's a low-income area, mostly immigrants and elderly residents. They don't have the resources to fight us, even if they wanted to. The casual cruelty in his voice made Margaret's stomach turn. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These were people's homes, their health, their futures being callously disregarded for profit. Perfect, Whitmore said, raising his glass, to successful business ventures and strategic planning. To staying ahead of the regulations, Sterling replied, clinking glasses. As Margaret continued her work, carefully moving around their conversation, she realized that fate had placed her in an extraordinary position. These men saw her as invisible, insignificant, just another service worker to be ignored. They had no idea that the woman quietly cleaning their study had spent 4 decades fighting exactly these kinds of corporate abuses in courtrooms across California. They had no idea that Margaret Chen wasn't just a maid, she was a weapon they'd unknowingly armed against themselves. That evening, Margaret sat in her cramped studio apartment in the Richmond district, staring at the rain-streaked window as the city lights blurred into watercolor smudges. The contrast between her current reality and the opulent mansion she'd left hours earlier felt like living in 2 different worlds. Her small space, barely 400 square feet, contained the remnants of her former life. Law books stacked in neat piles, her California Bar Association certificate hanging on the wall, and boxes of case files she couldn't bring herself to throw away. The conversation she'd overheard replayed in her mind with crystalline clarity. Environmental fraud, shell companies, a community about to be devastated for corporate profit. The lawyer in her wanted to spring into action immediately, but reality held her back like invisible chains. Her phone buzzed on the small kitchen table. The caller ID showed her daughter's name, Sarah Chen Martinez. "Hi, sweetheart," Margaret answered, trying to inject warmth into her voice despite the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. "Mom, how was work today?" Sarah's voice carried that careful tone children use when they're worried about their parents, but trying not to show it. At 28, Sarah was a social worker in Oakland, married with a 2-year-old daughter that Margaret barely got to see anymore. "Fine, just fine," Margaret lied smoothly. "How's little Emma? She's growing so fast." "Mom, I've been thinking, maybe it's time you moved in with us. This whole maid thing, it's just temporary, right? You could help with Emma while you look for a new law position." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the familiar ache of pride and love warring in her chest. Sarah didn't understand, couldn't understand, that at 65, after the malpractice lawsuit that had destroyed her reputation and drained her savings, no law firm would touch her. The legal community had a long memory for scandal, even when it was undeserved. "I'm managing just fine here," Margaret said gently. "Besides, Elena says there might be opportunities for advancement with the Whitmore family. They have friends who might need household management." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but it was easier than explaining that she'd become invisible to the world she'd once commanded. Easier than admitting that she couldn't even afford to help her daughter with Emma's daycare costs. After ending the call, Margaret sat in the growing darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights. The silence of her apartment was oppressive compared to the constant activity of the mansion. Here, she had nothing but her thoughts and the weight of what she'd learned. She pulled out her laptop, an older model she'd managed to keep when everything else had been sold or repossessed, and began researching. Her legal instincts hadn't dulled, despite months of scrubbing floors and polishing silver. Henderson Manufacturing, environmental assessments, planning department records. What she found made her stomach turn. Henderson Manufacturing had a history of environmental violations dating back 20 years. Soil contamination, groundwater pollution, health issues in surrounding communities that had been quietly settled out of court. The pattern was clear to someone who knew how to read between the lines of legal documents and regulatory filings. The community Sterling had so callously dismissed wasn't just low-income immigrants and elderly residents. It was the Bayshore district, a vibrant neighborhood where families had lived for generations, where small businesses struggled to survive, where children played in parks that would soon sit atop toxic soil. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through demographic data. The area was home to over 3,000 people, including 2 elementary schools and a community health center that served the uninsured. These weren't statistics. They were lives that would be irrevocably damaged by Whitmore and Sterling's scheme. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner grocery store where she sometimes shopped, whose grandchildren attended one of those schools. About the elderly Vietnamese man who tended the small garden behind the community center, growing vegetables he shared with neighbors who couldn't afford fresh produce. About the young mothers pushing strollers through streets that would soon become industrial zones built on contaminated ground. Her phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number. "Margaret, it's David Kim." The name hit her like a physical blow. David had been her law partner for 8 years before she'd gone solo. He'd tried to warn her about taking on the pharmaceutical case that had ultimately destroyed her career, the one where key evidence had mysteriously disappeared, where witnesses had suddenly changed their testimony, where she'd found herself accused of malpractice for pursuing a case that had been sabotaged from within. "David," she said carefully, "it's been a while. I heard about your situation. Listen, I have a client who might need some consulting work. Nothing official, you understand, but someone with your experience in environmental law. The pay isn't much, but I can't practice law anymore, David. You know that." The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. "I'm not talking about practicing. I'm talking about consulting, research, case preparation. There are ways around the restrictions, Margaret. You're too good to be wasted on not whatever it is you're doing now." After David hung up, Margaret stared at her reflection in the dark window. For months, she'd accepted her fall from grace as final, irreversible. She'd convinced herself that invisibility was her new normal, that she deserved the punishment for the mistakes, real or fabricated, that had ended her career. But tonight, listening to Whitmore and Sterling plan their calculated destruction of innocent lives, something had awakened in her. The part of herself that had spent decades fighting for justice, protecting the vulnerable, holding the powerful accountable. She thought about the maid's uniform hanging in her closet, about Elena's kind smile, about the way she'd perfected the art of being invisible in rooms where secrets were shared. Maybe invisibility wasn't her punishment. Maybe it was her superpower. Margaret opened a new document on her laptop and began typing. If Whitmore and Sterling thought she was just furniture to be ignored, she'd use that assumption against them. She'd gather evidence, document their crimes, and find a way to stop them before they could destroy Bayshore District. The retired lawyer was about to come out of retirement, and she was going to do it from the shadows. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's awakening, and she'd transformed her approach to work at the Whitmore mansion, where once she'd moved through the house with resigned efficiency, she now operated with the calculated precision of an undercover investigator. Every conversation overheard, every document glimpsed, every phone call witnessed became part of a growing file she maintained in her apartment. The morning fog was particularly thick as Margaret arrived at the mansion, her cleaning supplies concealing a small digital recorder she'd purchased with her meager savings. Eleanor greeted her with the usual warmth, but Margaret noticed the stress lines around the older woman's eyes had deepened. "Is everything all right, Elena?" Margaret asked as they prepared the day's assignments. Eleanor glanced around nervously before pulling Margaret into the utility closet. "Strange things have been happening," she whispered in accented English. "Mr. Whitmore has been having meetings with people I've never seen before, men in expensive suits who speak in hushed tones. And yesterday, I found Mrs. Whitmore crying in her bedroom." Margaret's investigative instincts sharpened. "Crying? Did she say why?" "She wouldn't tell me, but she kept saying something about not knowing what Richard had gotten himself into." "Margaret, I've worked for this family for 15 years. I've never seen her so frightened." This revelation added a new dimension to Margaret's understanding of the situation. Perhaps Mrs. Whitmore wasn't complicit in her husband's schemes. Perhaps she was another victim. "Has she said anything else?" Margaret pressed gently. "Only that she's been having trouble sleeping. She asked me to prepare the guest room for her. She's been sleeping separately from Mr. Whitmore for the past week." Margaret filed this information away as she began her day's work. Today's assignment was cleaning the home office, a space adjacent to the main study where Mrs. Whitmore handled her charitable work and personal correspondence. As Margaret dusted the ornate desk, she noticed several documents scattered across its surface. Her trained eye immediately caught the letterhead of a prestigious environmental law firm, followed by words that made her pulse quicken: preliminary injunction, environmental impact, and Bayshore Development Project. Moving carefully to avoid suspicion, Margaret positioned herself to read more. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Catherine Whitmore personally, not to her husband or his business entities. It detailed a community group's request for legal representation in challenging the environmental permits for the Bayshore project. The law firm was seeking Mrs. Whitmore's financial support for the legal challenge, citing her known philanthropic work with environmental causes. Margaret's mind raced. Mrs. Whitmore had been approached by the very people her husband was planning to defraud. The irony was devastating and potentially explosive. As she continued cleaning, Margaret heard familiar voices approaching from the main study. She quickly activated her hidden recorder and positioned herself near the connecting door, which had been left slightly ajar. "The timeline has moved up," she heard Sterling's agitated voice. "The community group has gotten organized faster than we anticipated. They've hired Brennan and Associates." Margaret nearly dropped her dustcloth. Brennan and Associates was one of the most aggressive environmental law firms in California. If they were involved, the case had just become infinitely more dangerous for Whitmore and Sterling. "How is that possible?" Whitmore's voice carried a note of panic Margaret had never heard before. "Our contacts in the planning department assured us we had at least 6 months before any organized opposition could form. Apparently, someone's been feeding them information. Details about the Henderson acquisition, the shell company structure, even preliminary soil reports that shouldn't be public knowledge yet." Margaret frowned. Someone else was working against Whitmore's scheme, but who? And how were they accessing such detailed information? "Do we know who the leak is?" Whitmore asked. "We're investigating, but it has to be someone with access to confidential documents, someone inside our operation, or with connections to the regulatory agencies." "What about the community organizer leading the opposition? Maria Santos, isn't it?" "Santos is clean. She's a high school teacher. No legal background, no obvious connections to environmental groups. But she's been remarkably well informed about our business practices. Someone's definitely feeding her information." Margaret made a mental note of the name Maria Santos. If there was already organized opposition to the scheme, perhaps she could find a way to support their efforts without revealing her own involvement. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Sterling continued. "The property transfers need to happen this week, before Brennan and Associates can file for an injunction. Once we own the land through the subsidiaries, it becomes much harder for them to stop the development." "What about Catherine?" Whitmore's voice dropped to a whisper. "She's been asking questions about my business dealings. Last night she confronted me about some legal papers she'd received." Margaret's heart raced. Mrs. Whitmore was becoming suspicious of her husband's activities. "Handle your wife, Richard. We can't afford to have her getting involved with environmental lawyers. If she starts talking to the wrong people." "She won't," Whitmore said firmly, but Margaret could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Catherine may be naive about business, but she's loyal to the family. For all our sakes, I hope you're right. Because if this deal falls apart now, we're not just looking at lost profits. The environmental violations at Henderson are severe enough that if they come to light, we could be facing criminal charges." Margaret's pulse quickened. Criminal charges. This was no longer just about corporate fraud. This was about potential felony violations that could send both men to prison. As the conversation continued, Margaret learned that the property transfers were scheduled for Friday, just 4 days away. Once completed, the shell companies would own the contaminated land, and the cleanup liability would be structured to fall on entities that could be dissolved at will, leaving the community with no recourse for damages. After the men left, Margaret remained in the office, processing everything she'd learned. Mrs. Whitmore was potentially an ally. There was already organized community opposition led by Maria Santos. The timeline had accelerated dramatically, but most importantly, she now had recorded evidence of conspiracy to commit environmental fraud, evidence that could be devastating in the right hands. As she finished her cleaning duties, Margaret made a decision. It was time to stop being passive. It was time to reach out to the community organizers and offer her help. The invisible maid was about to step out of the shadows. The next morning arrived with an unusual crispness in the San Francisco air, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Margaret arrived at the Whitmore mansion an hour early, her heart pounding with the weight of what she was about to set in motion. Hidden in her cleaning supplies was a flash drive containing all the evidence she'd gathered, along with transcripts of the recorded conversations and her detailed legal analysis of the crimes being committed. Elena was surprised to see her so early. "Margaret, you didn't need to come in yet. The family isn't even awake." "I wanted to get a head start on the study," Margaret replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Mr. Whitmore mentioned yesterday that he might have important guests today." What Elena didn't know was that Margaret had spent the entire night in contact with Maria Santos and the legal team at Brennan and Associates. Through David Kim's connections, she'd managed to arrange a conference call where she'd shared everything she'd learned. The attorneys had been stunned, not just by the quality of the evidence, but by the identity of their anonymous informant. Margaret Chen, attorney Jessica Brennan, had said over the phone, "I remember your work on the Riverside chemical case in 2019. Your environmental law expertise was legendary. We heard about what happened with the pharmaceutical lawsuit. I'm sorry. The past doesn't matter now," Margaret had replied firmly. "What matters is stopping these men before they destroy an entire community." The plan they'd developed was risky but necessary. Margaret would need to gather one final piece of evidence, documentation of the actual property transfers scheduled for today. Meanwhile, Brennan and Associates would file for an emergency injunction, and Maria Santos would organize a media presence outside the courthouse. As Margaret began cleaning the study, she heard urgent voices coming from the direction of the kitchen. She moved carefully through the hallway and saw Mrs. Catherine Whitmore standing in her silk robe, holding a newspaper with trembling hands. Her usually perfectly composed face was pale with shock. "Elena, have you seen this?" Catherine's voice cracked with emotion. Margaret positioned herself within earshot while appearing to dust a nearby table. The newspaper's headline was visible from where she stood. "Community Group Challenges Bayshore Development. Environmental Lawyers File Emergency Injunction." "Mrs. Whitmore, what's wrong?" Eleanor asked with genuine concern. I think my husband is involved in something terrible. These lawyers contacted me weeks ago asking for help to stop this development, and I ignored them because Richard assured me it was just business competitors trying to create problems. But this article, it mentions shell companies, environmental fraud, deliberate contamination. Catherine's voice broke entirely. Margaret's heart went out to the woman. In that moment, she made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation she'd developed over the past months. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret said quietly, stepping forward, "may I speak with you privately?" Catherine looked up, startled to see the quiet maid who rarely spoke beyond polite greetings. Something in Margaret's tone made her nod, and she followed Margaret into the empty dining room. "Mrs. Whitmore, my name is Margaret Chen, and I need to tell you who I really am." Margaret's voice carried the authority she'd once commanded in courtrooms. "I'm a retired environmental lawyer, and I've been working in your home while gathering evidence of your husband's criminal activities." Catherine's eyes widened, but instead of anger, Margaret saw relief wash over her features. "You're a lawyer, thank God. I've been so frightened, but I didn't know who to trust or what to do. Your husband and Mr. Sterling are planning to complete fraudulent property transfers today that will leave the Bayshore community with no legal recourse for environmental cleanup. Thousands of people will be harmed, including children." Catherine sank into a chair, her hands shaking. "I suspected something was wrong when those lawyers contacted me. Richard became so angry when I mentioned it, more angry than I'd ever seen him. Then he started having secret meetings, taking calls at all hours. I've been sleeping in the guest room because I couldn't bear to lie next to him knowing he was hiding something terrible from me. Mrs. Whitmore, I need your help. The property transfers are happening today, and we need to stop them. But more than that, the community needs an ally with resources and credibility." Catherine looked up with sudden determination. "What do you need me to do?" Within an hour, Catherine Whitmore had contacted her personal attorney and was en route to the courthouse where the emergency injunction hearing was being held. She'd also called her financial advisor to immediately establish a fund for environmental cleanup and community support in the Bayshore district. Margaret remained at the mansion, knowing that her final act would require perfect timing. At 2 p.m., just as Whitmore and Sterling arrived for their planned meeting to execute the property transfers, Margaret emerged from the study where she'd been waiting. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying decades of courtroom authority, "I believe these documents belong to you." She placed copies of all the evidence she'd gathered on the mahogany desk, recorded conversations, financial documents, environmental reports, communication records. Both men stared at the papers in stunned silence. "You're just the maid," Sterling stammered. "I'm Margaret Chen, retired partner at Chen & Associates Environmental Law, and I've been documenting your criminal conspiracy for weeks. As we speak, your property transfers are being blocked by a federal judge. Your wife is testifying about your fraudulent activities, and federal investigators are executing search warrants on your offices." Whitmore's face went from confusion to rage to pale understanding. This is impossible. You're nobody. You're invisible." "Does that?" Margaret said with a slight smile, was my greatest advantage. 6 months later, Margaret Chen stood in the Bayshore Community Center, no longer invisible, but very much seen. Richard Whitmore and Thomas Sterling had been sentenced to federal prison for environmental fraud, conspiracy and racketeering. The contaminated Henderson property was being cleaned up using funds from Catherine Whitmore's Environmental Foundation, and the community was thriving under new, sustainable development plans. Margaret had returned to legal work as a consultant for Brennan and Associates, specializing in cases where corporations attempted to hide environmental crimes. Her experience had taught her that sometimes the most powerful position was the one people overlooked. Elena approached her after the community celebration, tears in her eyes. "I should have known you were someone special. You always carried yourself differently." "We're all someone special, Elena," Margaret replied, looking around at the families celebrating their victory. "Sometimes it just takes the right moment to remember who we really are." As Margaret walked home through the vibrant streets of Bayshore, streets that would remain healthy and safe thanks to her courage, she reflected on how losing everything had ultimately led her to find her true purpose. The invisible maid had become visible again, not by reclaiming her old life, but by using her unique position to protect others. Justice, she'd learned, sometimes came from the most unexpected places.